What does the law have to do with spirituality? This is a question which, let me put it this way, it's not a new idea. It's been discussed extensively. It's been discussed extensively by legal philosophers. It's been discussed extensively by philosophers who've been considering both the nature of law and the nature of an equitable, just society. Um, Whenever we talk about the state and the law today, we tend to think that there is in the words of the American Supreme Court and quoted so many times by our Supreme Court, there exists a Chinese wall between the church and the state. So politics and religion are separate. Law and spirituality are separate. State and religious institutions have to be separated if we want a good society. That seems to be the basis of our thinking. But let me put it this way. That may be the current form of thinking, but that is not what a large amount of both our philosophers and philosophers who are held in great esteem across the world have held. They've always held that for law to be completed, for the law to be a complete system, for law to be a system which is relevant for all of us, it has to be deeply integrated into spirituality. Now, let us discuss some of the philosophers, and I'll go back to my analysis later, but let us discuss some of the philosophers who clearly held that. One is, of course, as we all know, I don't know how many of us have discussed this, but Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi ji all the time clearly said that politics and religion cannot be separated. He always said the morality, politics, morality, religion, these are the key to a moral politics, that you have to have, both have to be integrated with each other. And if you separate one from the other, you basically kill off the spirit of each other. I would say that he was inspired by older Indian thinking, but I'll come to that later on. The second person whom we all know, and whom I'm a great fan of, whose writing is Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda very interestingly gave an example, which I quote to everybody. Swami Vivekananda once said, when he was asked this question about separation of law and politics, he said, for different people, you have to explain different things. People have proclivities towards different types of ideas, and you have to explain those ideas, to explain other ideas to those people, you have to talk in that term. So he says, in India, everything is spiritual. So to explain politics to India, you have to do it with spirituality. And he says exactly opposite in the world. He said in Europe or in America, interestingly commented that if you had to explain spirituality, you have to explain it in terms of politics. Swami Vivekananda also very clearly said that, there has to be, for you to have a political life, you have to work towards your own divinity. You have to, and that means that you have to be deeply inspired and have spiritual values. Acharya Vinoba Bhave, in modern terms, when talking about Sampurna Kranti, along with Lok Nayak Jayaprakash Narayan, also discussed this idea of that you need a spiritual, there has to be a spiritual element in this Sampurna Kranti. The spiritual development of individuals has to be one of the elements of why Sampurna Kranti was relevant. Now, again, we have seen the other very famous, eminent philosopher of our times, political philosopher of our times, Deen Dayal Upadhyay ji. Deen Dayal Upadhyay ji's idea of integral humanism, which now it's quite prevalent. People discuss that a lot. Also very, very clearly said is that the object of an individual is to follow his dharma to achieve moksha. That is the object of a person. And the object of the state is to ensure spiritual upliftment. Now, this is not a very new idea. This comes from the old conceptions of Indian ideas of the Indian state. But he spoke very deeply about it a number of times. Now, of course, Rishi Aurobindo's and Swami Vivekananda's is quite one after the other, deeply inspired. Rishi Aurobindo was deeply inspired by Swami Vivekananda, as we all know, and Paranjape sir has spoken in great detail about it. But I'll just mark this, that Rishi Aurobindo, when he spoke about Swaraj, he said Swaraj is awakens the inner divinity of the individual. That was the objective of Swaraj. So that was the objective of the state, of the laws, of having independence, is that your inner divinity is awakened. Now, that is, I think, is the best description of why one needs the law. And what is the scope of the law? Because law is, after all, a manifestation of the state. So your individual political freedom, which is a manifestation, which is demarcated in law, is about raising your individual divinity. Now, this is not only, if I say this is uniquely Indian, and a lot of us can say this is uniquely Indian, there is no issues with it. But I would say this just stretches across the world and across different cultures. This is idea that law and spirituality cannot be separated is not only Indian in many ways, it is across the world. In Islamic law, there are two ways to look at it. One says one way it has been approached, this relation between law and spirituality, is that divinity, law is a product of divine ordinance, whereby law has been given by God, by Allah, to be implemented here on humanity, on earth. And the other way to look at it in Islamic law is that the objective of humans is to create the new Medina, is to create a new ideal utopian state. In both components, in both approaches to the conception of law and spirituality, there has been a stress that law and spirituality cannot be separated. I'll just demarcate. I'll just mark some of the philosophers in modern years who've spoken about this. One is, I don't know how many of you read, and this I recommend reading. It's very interesting. Writer is Ali Shariati, who's Persian, who was from Iran and one of the members of the Iranian Revolution. He spoke extensively about how a state or laws which are separated from divinity or spirituality to that extent become devoid of humanity. Then again is this entire concept of then the other major philosopher whom I will mark for your for you to sort of go through is Allama Maududi. Allama Maududi is extremely controversial, but nonetheless, Allama Maududi spoke about divine origin of law on earth, and he said that you have to have the link between both. It's extremely important. The other similar sort of idea to Shariati, somewhere between Allama Maududi and Ali Shariati, is Muhammad Iqbal, whom we all very famously know in India as a great poet, and the writer of Sare Jahan Se Acha. Now, Muhammad Iqbal also spoke about of the fact that for a true law, for a true state to happen, there has to be an amount of spirituality involved in the law. Now, in that being said of Islamic law, now I'll approach into Christian political philosophers who've dealt with this problem, who's grappled with this problem, and who have spoken in great detail about this entire conception of law and spirituality. Now, there is a long Christian history as to these interlinkages between law and spirituality, because according to me, this is not a new idea, and this has deep roots in the context in which Christianity arose in the Roman Empire, where law and spirituality were not distinguished at all. Now, the person who's a great, the person who speaks a lot about it is, of course, Saint Thomas Aquinas. Saint Thomas Aquinas, and who talks about, you have to create God's kingdom on earth, and a city upon a hill, that's the state, and people should aspire to that. That has to be a divine city on a hill inspired by divine values. In today's world, and I'll just mark it, there are two strains of thought which talk about that, there has to be involvement of spirituality in law, in terms of state functions. One is Christian democracy, Christian democratic parties in Germany, whom you've heard of, and one of the most important ideologue of Christian democracy is Jacques Maritain. Now, Jacques Maritain, who also ironically or coincidentally, I would say, had whose ideas were also called integral humanism, actually believed that both the spirituality and temporality cannot be separated and should not be separated. And he proposed the idea of a Christian democracy. In very tough times, in very difficult times, he lived through Nazi Germany, but Christian democracy as an idea is still very much a part of European politics. The other is the other leftist interpretation of Christian theology called liberation theology. I don't know how many of you have heard of it, which says you have to use Christianity as a tool of revolution. And this has been hugely promoted in South Africa, in South America, in parts of Asia, including in India. We've seen it around us, being articulated by a lot of people. That is one. That is to talk about political philosophers and legal political philosophers who address the conception of state and law and try to figure out whether they are separate or whether they are together. According again to a lot of legal and political philosophers who are very relevant today, there doesn't seem to be a difference between law and spirituality, and they cannot be disconnected from each other. Now, the other way to look at it is, how has the law been conceived? What is the conception of law, and how have people always conceived the law as a sort of historical development? Now, if we look at it from that part, or that angle, now we see that in Indian law, the original conception of the world in the Rig Veda talks about Rita. Rita is a universal law which encompasses everything, which runs through the entire universe. And that is the law of Rita. From Rita, then there is the development of Dharma, which means that everybody acts in a web of Dharma, and the object of Dharma is Dharma, Artha, Kama, and to achieve moksha. So there is a huge spiritual element within Dharma. Dharma cannot be seen. Dharma is the one which holds the world together. Comes from the word dra, as we all know. But it is also important to know that you cannot be a dharmic person. You cannot act in a dharmic manner unless there is a spiritual element to that. Because the objective of Dharma is to receive moksha. The third part of it, and I say this with great respect, that the other part is to ensure that you follow Dharma. There is this conception of danda. Danda means that you're punished. You are punished not because you have broken Dharma or you've broken the law. You are punished because you have fallen. And the objective of danda is to ensure that you follow the path of Dharma, is to ensure that you are again lifted up to the path of Dharma. So therefore, the king in ancient times in India was exemplified as a representative of danda on earth. And that is of the origin of his divinity. And, I don't know how many of you know that in older Indian thinking, in political thinking, danda was worshipped as a god because it was perceived that it was important for you to achieve dharma, that you should, that danda is very important to achieve dharma. Similar sort of ideas exist in Buddhist thinking, which sort of is deeply inspired or is a product of ancient Indian thinking. So whether you have the concept of Dhamma, whether you have the concept of Chakravarti, or whether you have the conceptions of Dharma Shastra, which was taken into Buddhist law through Dhammatat, which was ideas and conceptions of Indic conceptions of law, which was translated across the board wherever Buddhists took their law. So they are all deeply inspired and they cannot be separated. Anyone who knows the history of Burma, anyone or Myanmar, or anyone who knows the the way of governance in Tibet. And Buddhist law has always stressed that the conception of Dhamma cannot be separated from a conception of just rule, the rule of Chakravarti, of universal king in the world. So law is a product of the state, but it has to be for the objective of achieving Dhamma. That has been a great part of Buddhist thinking. Now I'll go back to two European thinking, which is parallelly on the point. One is the entire conception of in Rome and in Roman thought and Greek thought. In Roman thought, religion is very parallel to the word religion comes very parallel to the word dharma, which means to bind. It's an obligation amongst people. Exactly what dharma, it comes from the word religio, which means to bind people. It means to tie people. It's people's obligations. And it came down to divinely inspired norms, which we sort of work towards, so that we can have a just and fair society, which is what the gods wanted on earth. Now, people, the whole objective was this religio, this sort of thing which bound everybody together, is interpreted by jurists, by judges on earth amongst the people. That is what it was looked at. That was the theory, original theory of Roman law. And it was believed during the Roman Republic that law and divinity could not be separated. And I'll give you an interesting anecdotal example of that. I think one of the most important offices of the Roman Republic was the office of the chief priest of Rome, or the Pontifex Maximus, which incidentally, Julius Caesar held, and therefore he was a great important political player in the formation and sort of a person who was relevant in the formation of law in the Roman Republic, and before he became consul of Rome. Now, what is the today's remnant of Pontifex Maximus in today's world? Pontifex Maximus is actually the Pope. So that is the history of law in Roman history. Now, if you come down to Greek history, whether you be Plato, whether it's Aristotle, they have always stressed that law and law and divinity and spirituality cannot be separated. Now, if you go, very famously in Iliad of written by Homer, there is words which are used over and over again. He says, justice is divinely inspired. And if any one of us know about Greek law and Greek thinking, we've always sort of, you will see that justice is a product of, is always taken to be as if it's an expression of divine will. Again, in Greek law, whether it be Aristotle or it be Plato, it said, law is universal. There is law which cuts across all human beings of all things. There is one law, and it's interpreted by judges. It's immutable. People would say that it's immutable, unchangeable, and it's applied amongst people by judges. So again, there is a huge amount of spirituality in Greek law, in old Greek thinking, and old Roman legal thinking. In Chinese thinking, whether it be conceptions of Tao, whether it be conceptions of Confucianism, they are very similar to the Indian conceptions of Dharma. And I say this across the board, that if you look at older civilizations, if you look at ancient civilizations, if you look at the old way the world is viewed, you will see that law is never separated from spirituality. Law is part of spiritualities. It is assumed, whether it be Indian law, whether it be Greek law, whether it be Roman law, and it's absolutely similar. Chinese law, if you read all of them, and you read them, or for that matter, whether it be Persian law before the formation of the New Zoroastrian states or the Sasanian empires. You look at it and you will see that the conception of law is largely the same, that there is a universal law, which is a manifestation of divinity, which is spiritual, and the objective of judges is to interpret the law to make the people more spiritual. But coming back to today's world, we have now a conception of law which treats law as purely temporal. And that is why we have that conference today. Otherwise, if law was taken to be or a manifestation of spirituality, if that was the theory of law, today we wouldn't have even had this conference. The reason why we have this conference is because we have been taught that law and spirituality are completely different. Our conception of law conceives spirituality as in a different box than that is the law. Now, where does the idea start from? The idea originally starts from the Roman Empire, when it sort of comes up with the jus civilis. Jus civilis is when for law for civilians, when it governs this very large empire and sees all sorts of people and it wants to govern them, and they don't follow the same religion, they have different faiths. So the best way it thinks it can is to have a law which is in many ways not divinely inspired, but comes from a code. So the first codification of law in many ways, putting it into very specific legal injunctions emanating from the king, actually comes from the Roman Empire. And then, not very coincidentally, this conception of law completely disappears, and just disappears after the fall of the Roman Empire. So it goes again back to Christian theology, Christian interpretations of law for nearly 800 years, and comes back again. For the first time, we see it again being talked about is during the French Revolution. And the ideas which we have today is from the French Revolution, which says that everybody is separate, law is separate, spirituality is separate. There is a difference between church and state, and this goes back to that 200 years before the French Revolution, or 300 years before the French Revolution, which during when the struggle of the church and the king happens in Europe. But this is a very, very new development in law. Law has never been perceived in that way. Anyone who even knows the struggle of the struggle between law and state, and knows the ideas of canon law, which existed before that, of even common law, which has its origins in canon law, in laws formulated by the church, knows that there is a huge, deep interlinkage which still exists today. The gowns that we wear, the bands that we still wear, which we inherit from the common law tradition, it has its origins in the church. So there is a huge background to that. So it's never been in that way treated separately. Anyone who studies common law will know that a large amount of conceptions of common law comes from actually canon law, which is church law. But we have in our minds today separated. So the question is, 300 years later, when we have sort of considered this law to be a society, we've started treating society as an individual unit. Every human is individual. Society is purely taken on the basis of political, of economic, and devoid of any spiritual element. I would say what has resulted from that. I think today, as we can judge for ourselves, that people have lost meaning in their lives, and society has got completely confused, and states have no purpose. If your only purpose is to have purely politics, if your only purpose is to have pure economic development, it confuses. You lose the objective of a righteous state, of a just state, of a spiritual state, and the loss is ours. And the loss we can see is reflected every day. I think when we became independent 70 years before, we were a much more spiritual society to that extent, is because we did not have, for the want of a better word, and I'm not using it as the Western in a pejorative way, but the Western, Western ailment of merely existing for the purposes of consuming, or just of not having spirituality, of a politics which does not have at its heart spirituality. Maybe because we were inspired by Mahatma Gandhi, maybe because we looked up to leaders like Jayaprakash Narayan ji at a later point of time, or Acharya Vinoba Bhave, or whoever. We thought that spirituality was a great part of Indian political life, and therefore it dictated the state. But especially over the last 30 years after 1990, the state has promoted an idea of the state which is largely in many ways economic and political, because that was the dominant idea of the liberal ideas which happened in the 1990s globally all over the world, which said that you have to look at the state and individuals at a purely economic and political level. Of course, there's a new backlash, and we see that backlash across the world globally against this sort of thinking. But it has existed and has created this, in many ways, I would say, an enormous society where individuals have been broken up into smaller and smaller units. They are only perceived as economic and political units. And as a result, the anomaly which we have in the state today, where no one follows any rules, no one, no one thinks about their fellow people, is a product of that. My suggestion, in conclusion, what would be my suggestion? I would ask, and I would say that we have to bring back the idea of divinity and law, divinity into law and legal processes. We have to bring spirituality back to the heart of the state. What is the object of dharma? What is the object of the law? What is the object of having of having a state which governs us all? I think the most important object is to ensure that people follow their dharma, and the object is to ensure upliftment of its people, and spiritual upliftment of its people is a huge part of is the object of the state. And I don't think, and there are people who will tell you that our constitution is secular, there is no place for spirituality in our constitution merely, but that's a new interpretation, I would say. And I would say that's an interpretation which has gained a lot of traction in the last 30 years after the 1990s. I think if you look at Krishna Iyer's the integral yoga of the constitution, who was in many ways a judge who came from a very leftist background. And you look at the interpretation of law with some of the Constituent Assembly people participate in the Constituent Assembly held, and some of the judges in the initial days, the Constitution was taken to be a method for spiritual upliftment. I think we should now move towards an interpretation of the Constitution which sort of looks at a legal framework which is inspired by the ideas, as I said, of our old ancient heritage of Lord Ram, of Yudhishthir, and of Raja Ashok, rather than look at the world through the eyes of Bentham, Mill, and someone who's so much discussed in the world today, Adam Smith. Thank you very much.